This is Deborah Holchip, editor of Michigan Today. In this episode of Listen in Michigan, my guest is Will Potter, an award-winning author, investigative reporter, and internationally recognized civil liberties advocate. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Le Monde, the Sydney Morning Herald, and CNN, to name just a few. Will is best known for his work challenging government repression and the labeling of protest as, quote-unquote, terrorism. I saw him moderate a panel at Rackham with journalists who broke the Panama Papers and the Luxembourg leaks stories. The event really underscored the critical role that a free press plays in our society, especially now that President Trump has labeled that free press as the, quote, opposition party, unquote. I realize we spend much of our time talking about the impact of fake news from the consumer's perspective. But what about the impact on reporters and editors out there, the ones being insulted and attacked for doing their jobs? So I turned to Will. He is the Howard R. Marsh Visiting Professor of Journalism at U of M right now. And not surprisingly, he teaches classes about investigative reporting, social movements, and whistleblowing. He came to U of M in 2015 as a fellow in the university's Knight-Wallace program for journalists. He also has more than one tattoo, restores vintage motorcycles, and he plays with the punk band Rise Against. But that's a story for another day. So for now, let's go to my conversation with Will. It makes good sense to start from the beginning, define our terms. How do you define fake news?
Propaganda. I think the whole invention of this term of fake news lately is really a nicer way of saying, a strategy that's been around and used for a very long time by people in power of just outright propaganda, spreading lies and manipulating the facts in order to push a political agenda. And now we're seeing that in a very different way now, obviously, with the rise of social media and how it's been used to influence the election and those types of things. But the root of it is really using and manipulating facts and lies to push a political agenda.
So how is that different, say, from tabloid news or a disinformation campaign?
It's kind of a fine line. So like with tabloid news, I think most people will see stuff at the supermarket and know that it's just for entertainment purposes. When you see the big alien autopsy discovery, it's not having that much of a bearing on the political process. The difficulty lies when information about that political process and about real-world events is blurred, so we can't quite tell the source and how it's manipulated. And that's becoming increasingly difficult. There's so many new news organizations and media websites and independent and citizen journalists that it's difficult to verify the credibility and authenticity of some of those reports. And so it leads to people being duped or just willfully blind to what they're reading as well.
Most would agree that the free exchange of ideas and education is critical to democracy, and that's something that we're really focused on here. So that leads me to this fall, LSA is going to offer that course. It's called Fake News, Lies, and Propaganda, How to Sort Fact from Fiction. What do you think about that?
I think it's fantastic. U of M has really been taking the lead addressing these issues. There's a teach out being planned right now, reaching outside of the university community that I'm involved in here on campus.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she'll be coming up in the next couple of months, addressing these topics, and then seeing something like this on campus is fantastic. I would even go further, though. I think we as a culture need to start talking about these issues at a very young age. Elementary school, to foster digital literacy, media literacy, to help students understand, one, the role of a free press and a democracy. And then, connected to that, how do we evaluate the news that we're consuming? Even in my classes here at the University of Michigan, sometimes I've had issues with students bringing in pieces of what they think is investigative journalism from a site that's not credible. It's clickbait, just trying to get Facebook likes and shares with sensational headlines. And that's really dangerous. It's one thing if it's that alien autopsy video or something we know is a guilty pleasure or something fun we're clicking on our phones, when we're waiting for a doctor's appointment. It's another thing when this stuff is being passed off as news. So I really believe firmly that at a very young age we need to help students get these skills to understand what's at stake.
It's really all about critical thinking.
It
right?
is.
And
yeah.
how I guess that is a skill that needs to be taught. It just doesn't come naturally.
Well, it's critical thinking in a very specific way, though. So you have to look at a story and be able to evaluate the assumptions that are behind it. In newsrooms, as journalists, we're familiar with how this process works, how you frame a story, what's newsworthy, what's your lead and the angle of the story, your sources. But I think consumers are becoming more and more passive in how they're engaging with the news. So not evaluating the outlet itself, who the journalist is, who's quoted and not quoted, and what the broader context of the story is, what's left out of the piece. All of those things aren't necessarily the most intuitive questions to be asking, but really shape how we perceive the news. We have so much going on in all of our lives. You have kids and family and work, and it's easier to just rely on whatever pops up on your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed or whatever, and read it and consume it and move it along with your day. But that can be really dangerous when there are people out there paying a lot of money to manipulate what you're consuming, as we've seen in the last election.
Yeah, strangely enough, out of Macedonia, I understand. There's like hundreds of fake sites just writing weird things about our country for money.
And more money than I make here as a freelancer too, which is especially
so
disturbing.
Scary. Yeah.
There's more money to be gained in this fake news, and that's why I go back to that idea of fake news as propaganda, because I think this term is being used to really take the teeth out of what fake news actually is. It makes it sound like it's some, accident, and that's not true. I mean, this is a deliberate manipulation of audiences to push a political agenda for a very specific purpose. And that's very different than if a news outlet makes a mistake or if there's an error in a story. That's not fake news. That's a mistake. And a reputable news outlet will be forthcoming with that, would publish it the same day or, in the next day's paper, a list of corrections. This is a different animal. Just because you don't like something, you can't use that as a catch-all term to silence your opposition. You have to critically engage and think through the argument and what they're presenting.
Well, I read this BBC piece this morning, and it was interesting that we're moving toward a place of not so much what to believe, but who to believe.
When we're thinking through who to trust and who to believe, that's really extending to journalists as individuals or as brands, for lack of a better term now. I mean, there's a new report that I was just reading about how audiences are increasingly willing to follow journalists and so-called thought leaders and all these buzzwords wherever they go, and they're not necessarily tied to a specific media outlet. So that's very different than how I came up as a journalist, that we were told not to put ourselves front and center, not really exposing yourself as the individual. You have your byline, but that's it. You're really relying on the credibility of your news outlet where you're working. And what we're seeing now is all those lines are being blurred because journalists, as part of our craft, we have to be on Twitter, we have to be on social media, we have to be public and doing these types of things. And so, that credibility is extending to those outlets as well.
You're in a unique position here. You are a professional journalist, and now you're in this academic setting. So what are you learning by virtue of being here and not in the newsroom all the time or out on a story all the time?
It's a great balance. The nature of the work I report on and my specific beat of national security, civil liberties, human rights violations is pretty grim, to put it mildly. So to be able to engage with students on a daily basis and to see their excitement and their enthusiasm and be able to disprove this narrative of how millennials are apathetic and disinterested in the news and all this stuff is really exciting to me. On the other hand, though, it's kind of a mixed blessing to be teaching, especially teaching investigative journalism in this era. On the one hand, the downfall is that my syllabus always has to get thrown out the window every single class period based on whatever happening in the news, the president calling the press the enemy of the people and
the opposition party.
On and on. Yeah, it's just terrifying. But on the more positive side, it's an opportunity to engage with these issues in real time with students, and that's been really rewarding for me and also for them.
Do you feel like they get it? Do they understand how grave it is?
They do. Sometimes it takes a little bit of guidance of connecting some of the dots of what the significance is of, the the president, again, saying the press is the enemy of the people, or saying things like CNN in the New York Times are fake news, you have to have a historical context for that. And I think that's one thing that students are sometimes missing, is being able to understand those statements, not just as a tweet, but as a tweet in this specific moment in history and why that's so dangerous. I've seen in my classes, I think students and all of us in the United States have a tendency to take the press for granted, that we've always had a First Amendment and we always will. We have press freedoms greater than many other countries, and we're seeing that slipping away. The United States is falling in global press rankings. We're seeing unprecedented attacks on journalists and whistleblowers, and I think that historical context is more important than ever to know what the dangers are right now.
How personally do you take it when the president says journalists are the enemy of the state or the opposition party?
I take it very personally on a few different levels. I mean, on the most broad level, just as a citizen, just makes me sick to my stomach. You know, in my work, I'm very critical of a lot of government policies, and that's the nature of being an investigative journalist. But I think across party lines, I hope as a country we could say that no matter what you object to that's happening right now in the United States, the free press is not part of the problem. It has to be part of the solution. The only way we can start seeing what people in power are doing is through a robust and free and uninhibited press. And if we start chipping away at that, it's going to be a golden age for political corruption, both at the local and at the federal level. You know, more personally, though, as an investigative journalist and as someone who focuses on government abuse, FBI surveillance, mislabeling people as terrorists and things like that, it also makes me concerned for my own well-being. When the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN are being attacked as fake news, that has a chill. I mean, it sends a very chilling message to journalists at lower level, so to speak, media outlets that don't have the prestige and money, freelancers like I've been for years. You go into journalism because you believe in the potential of the press in having a positive impact on democracy. We're the only profession that's singled out in the very First Amendment to the Constitution, and that's for a reason, because there is so much at stake. And so once we start whittling away at journalists, at their sources, at whether or not they can be trusted, I think it sets a really dangerous precedent for where we're heading for the future of the republic, the future of our democracy. People in power are threatened by a critical press. Every presidency, every administration. Yeah. This is not a partisan issue, right? A good, robust press is always the thorn in the side.
Even George W. Bush thinks so.
Was that not shocking? I mean, this is a sign of the times right now that you can see how not partisan this is. Where you have George W. Bush had his share of run-ins with the critical press. But I think the takeaway has to be the reason that those individuals want to neutralize and delegitimize the press is because once you do so, it completely eliminates that check and balance on what they're doing. So if we can just say, hey, we don't need a press, we don't need the New York Times to report on what the president is doing. He has a Twitter account. That's a godsend for a president because you can just distort and manipulate and spin straight to the American people, and you don't have those pesky journalists in the way fact-checking and investigating and digging deeper to find out if it's actually true. So if there is good journalism that you support it by subscribing and keeping that outlet afloat.
Do you foresee a time when journalists will suffer more from burnout and depression as a result of all this craziness that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's something
What are you hearing from your friends out there in the field?
People are struggling. The state of the craft in the U.S. has been rough for a while. There have been hiring freezes, closure of bureaus, entire departments cut, budget freezes, buyouts. I mean, just on and on with no real end in sight. And then when you add on top of that attacks from the most powerful position in the world on the most free press in the world, it sends a very chilling message. For some journalists, I think that translates into that burnout. like you said, or maybe a career change, which is really unfortunate. There's an institutional memory that's lost when that happens, of people that have spent their lives devoted to journalism. And if they're being bought out or early retirement or have to go into public relations or just some other career entirely to pay the bills, we're losing as a country from that. Not just journalism, but we as a democracy are losing from that. But I've also been more and more open about my own struggles with PTSD and depression related to, like I said, the nature of investigative journalism is dealing with very dark stuff day in and day out. And I think journalists have done a really poor job of supporting our own profession. We talk about PTSD when it comes to foreign correspondence in war zones, but not in the day in, day out challenges of reporting on what's happening here at home. In my journalism class here at U of M, I talk about Murray Martyr at the Washington Post, who was the only journalist assigned to cover McCarthy full time. Other journalists had that position, and they couldn't handle it, and not at a lack of expertise or determination on their part, but it was just so grueling and debilitating. And he was very open about the toll it took on him and his family. And we have to be willing to support people like that. Martyr's work was instrumental in exposing the fraud of McCarthyism. And we need more journalists who are going to be in it for the long haul who can continue to do that type of work.
I saw a story, I think it was just yesterday, that the Colorado Daily Sentinel is threatening to sue this senator, Ray Scott, for defamation. So it's the newspaper filing suit against the senator for characterizing an opinion column as fake news on Twitter. It's such a reversal.
Right,
generally
right.
It's the senator would be suing the newspaper for defamation. What's going on there? And what do you think that means for the future?
Well, I don't know if anyone knows what it means right now, but what I see is kind of a confluence of all of those trends that we're discussing, right? You have the rise of social media, of politicians attacking the press as fake news, in this case, attacking an opinion piece that even more ironically was about the state senator's refusal to move forward discussion on an open records revision at the state level. So, it's truly surreal, right? I would tell my fiction students that if they were to write this out in a short story or in a novel, it'd be a little too heavy-handed, right? That's how I feel more and more as I'm watching the news. One, it's not fake news, it's an opinion. It's an opinion based on fact, but it's still opinion. So it kind of circles back to what we were saying before, just using that term fake news to attack opinions that you don't like. On the one hand, I'm excited to see journalists pushing back, as we have to do very strongly against this language of fake news, especially when it's coming from elected officials. That's completely inappropriate. On the other hand, there's a reason that news outlets have historically been reluctant to turn the tables in that way, because as journalists, I think we have a special reverence for the First Amendment and are really reluctant to try to silence people, even when they're saying things that are outright crazy or defamatory or dangerous or whatever it is, scandalous. So I'm a little bit reluctant in that regard, especially in a case like this. If the media outlet loses, that could set a pretty dangerous precedent. So I think it's a good example of how we're all just trying to kind of fumbling in the dark right now, trying to figure out how to balance this new digital environment with this new kind of toxic political environment attacking the press, while also trying to defend ourselves in our craft when it's needed more than ever. I saw the Washington Post change their tagline to now saying, "Democracy dies in darkness."
It's going to be interesting 10 years down the line or 50 years down the line to see kind of how it all plays out.
The thought of what this could look like in a negative way 50 years from down the line is terrifying. And to me, that just reflects, I feel like my blood pressure just went through the roof. How much is at stake right now? For all of us, I'm speaking selfishly, obviously, as a journalist, but the reason I do this work is because it matters to every single person in this country. And the more I travel internationally for my work and meet with other journalism colleagues around the world, the amount of concern that they have right now, watching from abroad what's happening in the United States, has really driven that point home to me, that we can't just shrug this off and pretend it'll blow over. I mean, we are an example, for better or worse, in a lot of different ways, particularly on freedom of the press for other journalists around the world as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we could end with the possibility that on the bright side, maybe this is the best thing that could happen to journalism, right?
I mean, I am still militantly optimistic right now, particularly because of the position I have at the university and dealing with students. They are seeing through the noise and the clutter in a way that I think I really underestimated. And the more I'm doing public speaking events, and we had an event on campus just last week with the journalists who broke the Panama Papers and the Luxembourg leaks, and the response from that was just overwhelming. So my note of optimism, or my positive note to end on, would be, I think people want investigative journalism and critical news more than ever. So it's a prime opportunity to actually step up to the plate and deliver that. I think that's the task we have right now as journalists.
Well, clearly, there is no time to waste. As Will pointed out, the free press is far too precious to take for granted. I'd like to thank him for joining me today, and thank you for listening. If you like the podcast, you can listen and subscribe by going to SoundCloud, iTunes, or TuneIn, and search for Listen In, Michigan. The podcasts also are available under the podcast tab at michigantoday.umich.edu. Have a great day. We'll be back next month, and until then, go Blue.